Yes. So, first of all, for today's press conference, we have interpretation in English, French, and German, which you can select on your interface. And with that out of the way, we go straight to the point. So the PEGA committee has now been working since April of this year, and now the rapporteur of the committee has compiled her first draft of its final report. It will be debated later in committee, and the other political groups will also add their amendments, and the process will continue later. But today we will hear from the rapporteur, Sophie and Veld, to talk us through the current version. Sophie, please.
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Before I go to the substance of the report, two things. First of all, I owe a big thank you to the people who've helped me prepare this report. First of all, Meerte, Kira and Stijn in my office, who've been literally working around the clock and delivering this text last night at 1:30. Andy, of course, Michael, Hendrik, Alexandra, Sarah, Ottavio, Emily and Stefan. I would also like to thank Pegasus Project, Citizens Lab and Amnesty, and also all those diligent and courageous journalists who have done an amazing job in bringing wrongdoing to light. Because I also realize that many of them pay a price for it. They're threatened, intimidated, slapped, and victims of spyware themselves. And I think Europeans owe them gratitude for the work they're doing for democracy, because they are our very own Woodward and Bernstein. Very quickly about the procedure and the status of the report. This is, let's say, a first picture, if you want, after, 7 months of work, I believe. We still have 4 to 7 months to go, in principle, until March, unless we get an extension, until June. The first exchange of views will be on the 28th of November. As to our work method, because basically none of the authorities has been willing to work with us, so we got very little official information and confirmation, and of course, therefore, we had to work on the basis of publicly available sources, which we have done. And I think, as I always like to put it, we have, let's say, 900 pieces of a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. So it's not complete, but I think we can see very clearly what the image is. And if anybody has any complaints about the quality of the evidence, I would call on the authorities to stop obstructing and be transparent and share information. And I would like to point out here that last night we got the reply from the Council to a letter we sent in July saying, thank you very much for your letter, but it's none of your business, European Parliament, and we feel not accountable to anyone. On the report. Let me start by making a comparison. Recently, Elon Musk took over Twitter, and there is deep concern all around that he will give free rein to hatred and unleash the anti-democratic forces. Commissioner Thierry Breton immediately spoke out very firmly and warned Musk with a tweet, for instance, where he says, "In Europe, the bird will fly by our rules." The Commission is very determined to fight attacks on democracy from the outside. We have even a democracy action plan. We fight against fake news, foreign interference, etc. But when the attacks on democracy come from within, the Commission is silent. When the threat to democracy is not some faraway stranger, but the governments of EU member states, the Commission suddenly considers that the defence of European democracy is no longer a European matter, but a matter for the member states. The Commission shows muscle to Musk, but velvet gloves to member states using spyware on citizens. And let's be clear, the abuse of spyware in EU member states is a grave threat to democracy on the entire continent. And just at the time where we need democracy more than ever. In this time of crisis, we need reliable and responsible and accountable governments. The abuse of spyware does not just violate the right to privacy of individuals. It undermines democracy and democratic institutions. It silences opposition and critics, eliminates scrutiny, and it has a chilling effect on free press and civil society. It serves to manipulate elections. The spyware scandal is not a national scandal. It's very much a European scandal. We tend to look at it through the keyhole of national politics. But if you connect the dots, suddenly another image emerges, and suddenly you see this is an entirely European matter. For example, it affects directly the EU institutions, as MEPs, commissioners, commission officials, and ministers have been targeted. Perpetrators, on the other hand, also sit on the Council, the European Council. It affects the integrity of elections and of decision-making in the EU. It also touches upon a wide range of European laws and policies, like the GDPR, but also export rules, procurement rules, whistleblower protection, and what have you. We also observe that the spyware industry is a very shady industry, opaque and elusive, and with very low ethical standards. The term mercenary spyware sums it up nicely. But it's fully Europeanized, making use of the internal market, Schengen, and the reputation of the EU label. Europe offers excellent conditions for the industry, including weak enforcement of rules. Thus, Europe has facilitated the exports of spyware to Libya, Egypt, Bangladesh, and other model democracies, where it has been used against human rights defenders and journalists. So I think we have a couple of questions to ask ourselves as this community of values. But let's have a look at what's happening in Europe itself. You will see in the report that we have a couple of country chapters. We've dedicated more space to some countries, but also space to some other countries. Let's start with Poland and Hungary. In a few words there, I think we see that spyware is an integral element of a system which is designed to control and even oppress the citizens, that is, the critics of the government, opposition, journalists, whistleblowers, and it's the whole system is very methodically set up. It's not by accident, it's not a random tool that they're using. Then Greece. Greece, which is providing us with new developments every day. Thank you very much. In Greece, the situation is very different. There you cannot say that it's, let's say, a deliberately authoritarian system. But in Greece, we do see signs, if it's all confirmed, of course, because we have to say this the whole time. We have to keep this proviso. But there, too, we see that it is being used let's say, in a very systematic and large-scale manner, clearly as part of a political strategy. Spain is an entirely situation. Again, a very delicate situation, as you understand. We have very little official information of what's happening, but what we do see is that there are strong indications that politicians and others have been monitored, spied upon, with no evident, imminent, immediate threat to national security. Now, I understand that it's delicate, and I would warmly invite the Spanish authorities to provide us with more information so that we can assess the situation. Cyprus, the last country that we have dedicated a bigger chapter to, will need to look into that a lot more. We have indications that spyware has been used on citizens, but I think most worrying in Cyprus is the hub for exports of spyware. But we need to recognize that all member states have spyware at their disposal. All of them. Even if they don't admit it, they do. So I've already said, they all play a role. Cyprus and Bulgaria, export hubs. Luxembourg is where spyware vendors do their financial business. Ireland offers fiscal conditions which are attractive. Malta, interestingly, seems to be a comfortable home to spyware bosses with golden passports and letterbox companies. Italy, France, and Austria are home to some very important manufacturers and vendors of spyware. The Czech Republic hosts every year the big fair, the spyware fair, also referred to as the wiretappers ball. The Netherlands, Germany and Belgium have sort of more or less admitted that their police forces are using it, although not entirely. The Netherlands, my own country, was apparently also in talks to acquire not just Pegasus, but also Predator, and it was also home to 2 companies which were connected to NSO. What we see is that some governments are abusing spyware, others are still behaving properly, but all of them use the cloak of national security to create an area of lawlessness. They pull the card of national security, and from that moment on, the doors close, the windows close, no questions asked, no accountability, you get no information, and this is also a problem for the victims. Because they go to the police or to a judge and say, please investigate my case because I think I've been targeted, but they're stonewalled. They get no information, and the prosecutor will say, yeah, but you have to prove that you were targeted. But you cannot prove it because you get no information. This is also a little bit the situation that the PEGA committee is in. Now, it's clear that measures have to be taken, so I have proposed a number of initiatives, just a small selection. First of all, I have proposed that there be an immediate moratorium. But the moratorium can be lifted on a country-by-country basis if 4 conditions are fulfilled. One is, in those countries where it applies, that all the allegations are properly investigated. 2, that the countries can prove that they have in place a framework for, let's say, responsible use of spyware. 3, that they consent to Europol proposals to investigate. You know that Europol has the power to propose an investigation, and we say that member states who want the moratorium lifted should consent to that. And 4, in those countries where it applies, that export licenses that do not pass the test have to be repealed immediately. Then, of course, we have to regulate the use of spyware in line with standards laid down in case law by the Human Rights Courts and by the Venice Commission. I think it's also important that we agree that there should be a common definition of national security, or at the very least, the obligation for member states to define what national security is, what is the area that national security applies to, and what regime will apply to that area. We need to enforce the export rules vigorously, because that, frankly, friends, is a joke. We have dual-use regulation, but the enforcement is really not serious. And then another one is, I call on the Council, the European Council, to convene a special summit dedicated to the abuse of spyware. But, and I'm coming to a conclusion, legislating and regulating alone will not do the trick, because without enforcement, legislation is futile. And in the increasingly intergovernmental Europe, the Commission shies away from enforcement, in particular in areas that touch upon European values. And we really need a profound rethink of the way that we have organized governance in the European Union. In recent months, the EU has very rapidly built its defences against attacks from the outside: war, pandemic, inflation, climate change. But when it comes to defending the most important thing, democracy and freedom, Europe is weak and impotent. The US have reacted very rapidly and with determination when the spyware scandal was revealed. And the US has withstood internal attacks on democracy. Watergate, January 6th. And yes, democracy is under pressure in the US as well. But their institutions are strong and they're still functioning, and they're not afraid to even confront the powers that be. but the EU is still immature as a democracy. I therefore believe that we need to launch a conference to discuss reform of the governance of the European Union, with or without treaty change. Let's not get bogged down in that, but in my view, we have to strengthen supranational enforcement. Otherwise, there's no point in having supranational policies. And I would call on the member states to make a start today and invite Europol in to investigate the spyware scandal, in particular the countries where spyware has been used for political reasons. And those countries I have mentioned, and they know who they are. And I would like to conclude by thanking all the colleagues. I'm grateful that we managed to set up this inquiry committee, because this time last year that wasn't obvious. But I believe that we can make an important contribution, because only the European Parliament is able to hold this inquiry. Governments, all of them, collectively, are trying to sweep it under the carpet. But we'll make sure it stays in the spotlights. The European Parliament will be the voice of Europeans. We will stand for democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions in the room? To start with?
About to say, am I that intimidating?
So, here, gentleman in the front row, please.
Hello, thank you. I'm Andrés Gil with El Diario, Spanish media. I would like to ask you a couple of questions regarding Spain. In your report, you say that the government has acknowledged 18 cases of 65 that includes the Catalan Gate. What are the rest of cases? What do you think that happens? Who is responsible for the rest of this spy? And also, you include the matter of Morocco. And do you have any other any other information or any other of the actions of the Moroccan government regarding the spy of the Spanish authorities? Thank you.
No, well, to begin with, I repeat what I said at the start. The only ones who can provide us with proof are the governments. But the governments say we're not accountable. You know, nobody can ask us any questions. So if they consider that some assumptions are wrong, then they will have to provide us with the material. And I think even, you know, there are even ways of doing so in under condition of confidentiality. We have the arrangements to do that. With regard to spying by third countries, I have to say that we have not looked at that very much, because it's, you know, we cannot regulate the Moroccan government. Any third country. This is also the problem with spyware. You can do this from anywhere in the world. So that's difficult to control. So we focus on what the European governments are doing, what the European Union is doing. So we have no proof that it was the Moroccan government, but this is what, you know, what we hear, or what is suggested by the Spanish and the French government.
All right. Next, we have someone.
Hi, I'm Dani Rovirosa from the Spanish news agency EFE. It's also some questions on Spain. Under your report, there's a sentence, it has surprised me. You say Spain, it's probably the first country of the European Union to have contracted the Pegasus. But there's a link to a media article. So, I mean, how can you be able to put that in the report if you don't have the information of the government? So will you still maintain it in the final report? Also on the mission to Spain, do you think it will be finally possible to go there? And in general views about the report, I mean, if you say you don't have too much information of public authorities, why should we assume that it's a valid report? Because there are maybe only assumptions.
Well, to start with the second question about the mission, I very much hope that we will have a majority in the PEGA committee to travel to Spain. As to the assumptions and the facts, again, I would be very grateful for factual information by the government. But you cannot say, we refuse to give you information, but you're not allowed to look at anything else. I mean, what are we supposed to do? Remain quiet and blind? And I think there are, that's why I made the comparison with the jigsaw puzzle. If you have a jigsaw puzzle of 1,000 pieces, 100 pieces are missing, you can still pretty much see what's going on. And I find it a bit, I mean, this is what the governments are also doing to the victims, to the targets, saying, we're not going to give you information about you being targeted, you have to prove it. You can't prove it, you know, if you don't get the information. And I have this funny old-fashioned notion that governments actually have to be controlled by citizens and not the other way around. And if you give powers to governments to control the citizen in exceptional cases, when you're talking about, I don't know, serious crime or grave threats to national security or something like that, that doesn't mean that you give carte blanche to the governments to do whatever they like. They're still accountable. And I find it deeply worrying that this kind of tools, some people call it a weapon, are used by governments and there is absolutely no accountability. I think that's very worrying in a democracy. And do we make assumptions? Yes, we make assumptions. But they're assumptions based on a lot of information that's out there, including information that is not coming from the media. And I think, well, you're a journalist. I think a lot of information from the media is reliable. And the problem here is that, you know, from the start, a lot of people have said, oh, this is all not true, it's invented, it's not true, and then it turns out to be true. So I do think that you can make a distinction between more reliable and less reliable sources. But if you want a report based on only hard facts, then talk to your government and tell them that they should share the information. Because in a democracy, that's the kind of thing that you do.
Yes, follow up, please.
You don't have not answered directly the question on why Spain do you think it's the first country to have PEGA?
Well, that I don't know. That maybe by look, that's a coincidence, I suppose. And let's not forget, because the committee is called after Pegasus, but there's a lot of other spyware out there. But it started from the Pegasus project, and then bit by bit you start to discover that there's a Predator is another very big one. You know, we also found, okay, very, 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 let's say, small indications that maybe the Spanish government has been looking into Predator as well. We've seen indications that the Dutch government's been looking into Predator as well. So if they were the first ones to buy Pegasus, well, somebody had to be the first one. So for me, that's not a political fact.
Right, thank you. And then here, please.
Good morning, Ardy Stemerding from NOS, the Netherlands. Mevrouw In 't Veld, what made you decide to organize this press conference without discussing the draft in your own committee? And in this perspective, how worried are you about the support in your own committee for the investigation?
Well, first of all, of course, you know, that's always preferable. But the thing is that here you have to translate all the documents, and by the very moment you send it out for translation, it's basically public. So I mean, we've been literally working deep into the night last night. We first sent it to the members this morning and only afterwards to the press. And I knew there were going to be a lot of questions, so I thought it's better than to have a press conference. But would I have preferred to first discuss it in the committee? Of course, but just you know, with the delay, that's just not possible.
Yes, follow up.
But is it just that, or are you also worried about the support for the investigation in your own committee?
Do I look like a worried person to you? No, I'm not worried. I think, you know, fair is fair. This committee is extremely politicized. And you can feel, I've written it in the report, you can on occasion feel the presence of the national governments in our debates. At the same time, I also see that people have, after maybe a slow start, they have really committed to working in this committee. I think when it comes to the recommendations, there I think, not on all recommendations, but I think on the vast majority, yes, I think we will find big consensus. But then, of course, on the country chapters, you know, there's going to be criticism, but more, and that will also be, let's face it, you know, linked to political party, nationality, somebody in opposition or in government. Okay, but that's all part of political life.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Maybe over there.
Ah, yes, please.
Merci beaucoup, c'est Griselda.
Thank you very much. From Spanish Radio's SER. You seem to be a bit upset with some governments which... I'm going to ask my question in French, but you seem a little bit annoyed with some of the governments which have not cooperated with you. I'd like to know what you are expecting from the governments and the European Commission now that you've actually got the conclusions of the report.
First of all, they're not final conclusions yet. This is a first draft. We'll keep working until the end of the mandate of the PEGA committee, so there will be a lot more information that will be fed in. There will also be a lot more development still. What I expect of national governments is what I said before, to behave like democrats. Be accountable to the citizens, be accountable to the public. You know, be accountable to the persons which have been illegitimately targeted. I know it's an old-fashioned notion, but in a democracy, putting people under surveillance should be an exception. And there should be rules. And it should not be possible to abuse it for political purposes, party political purposes, or for the purposes of hanging on to power, manipulating elections, or for the purposes of covering up corruption. So am I angry with the member states? Yes, maybe not equally with all, but what I am angry, you know, the one thing that I am angry about when it comes to all of them is how they are collectively refusing accountability. I've used the term omerta in the report. The letter we got from the council last night, after 5 months, I mean, that in itself is offensive. But, you know, the council, on the one hand, this is interesting, because the council says in its letter, it says, this is purely national matter, none of your business, butt out. But they have discussed it in the council. So the council itself recognizes that it is a collective, a European matter. You know, you cannot have both. You cannot say, when it suits us, it's European, when it doesn't suit us, it is national. And I really think that it is about time that the European Union grows up as a political union. Can we please, because this is all, the fact that this is happening is because there is a kind of vacuum between, a democratic vacuum between the European level and the national level. Either we are one open space with the markets, with Schengen, with everything I've mentioned, but then we're also one open democratic space, or it's purely national. You cannot have both. You know, you cannot say it's national whenever I don't feel like complying with the rules. So am I angry? Yes, because this is an attack on European democracy. Is that not a reason to be angry? Why is everybody, you know, today, elections in the US, and everybody going like, oh, it's very worrying, democracy in the US is under threat. Bolsonaro, oof, we're so happy that he wasn't elected because we would have been a threat to democracy. Why aren't we upset about democracy in Europe? Europe, that is, I mean, Europe has taken big steps in the last couple of years. You know, with the pandemic, we've been buying vaccines. We're shipping arms to Ukraine. We're talking about matters of life and death. And yet we consider that democracy is a purely national issue? And then, again, these governments, because these same people who are guilty of illegitimate spying on journalists like you, on politicians like me, on NGOs, those same people are sitting in the European Council and in the Council taking decisions that affect every single citizen in the European Union. And I did a little count. If you just the 5 countries which are in focus, which I've mentioned. Together, they have like 106 million inhabitants. That's almost a quarter of the European Union. Now, that carries political weight in the Council. Haven't we got reason to be worried about democracy? I think we do.
Thank you. And now we still have time for a few questions, and I'm going to give the floor to someone online for a change, if the people don't mind. George Syriopoulos, please. Please press the speak button, Mr. Syriopoulos. And
you should be able to speak now.
Yes. Yes. Can you hear me?
We hear you, but we don't see you at the moment. Could you please enable your...
Yes. Yes. I'm really sorry. I try to... okay. No. I don't know what and why. You can accept my questions without seeing me.
That's fine.
Yes? Okay, thank you. I'm George Syriopoulos for ERT-TV Greece, and I have a couple of questions. Ms. Veld, you mentioned the possibility of an attack against the Republic with the use of spyware by external actors. Are you considering this possibility for Greece? And since you mentioned the necessity of reliable sources, what are the most reliable sources from the member states in your research, and especially in Greece? My second question is that the Greek newspaper Documento, after your visit to Greece, multiplies the victims of surveillance. A judicial investigation has been launched for this publication. Will you await the outcome of this judicial inquiry before writing your final opinion, your final report about Greece? Are you planning a new trip to Greece, or will you invite the journalist who makes the revelations to speak to your committee, thereby accepting that the report is true without so far being verified? And if I can, I have a last question. Is there agreement among the members of the PEGA committee as to the conclusion about the findings in Greece, or are there different opinions? And of course, it would be useful to know the legal weight of this finding so that we know whether punitive actions will follow or actively contribute to limiting the use of spyware in Europe. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's a lot of questions. To begin with, the mandate of the inquiry committee runs until March, possibly until June. So no, this is only the picture of the situation at the moment, and we will continue our inquiry. That's obvious. As I said, in many cases we had to rely on sources other than government information, simply because governments refuse to share information with us. When it comes to Greece, I would think that there are a couple of things that the authorities can do. I understand it is in the discretion of the Prime Minister to lift the confidentiality on the cases of, let's say, legal interception, in particular of Mr. Androulakis and Mr. Koukakis. He could do that. He could shed light on that matter. The parliamentary, or the Parliament could decide to lift confidentiality on the papers of the inquiry committee. So I think there's already a lot of information out there, official information, that could be shared. So I don't know if by the time that we conclude our work, the inquiry in Greece will have been concluded. I don't know that. There's still, 4 to 7 months to go. But I also think that, this didn't... the revelations by Documento last weekend weren't the first revelations. This has been going on for a while. There have been complaints already last year. So I think the authorities, could have shown a slightly bigger sense of urgency in investigating. So I hope that now there is, I understand, an investigation by the general prosecutor, and I hope that will be done quickly. The problem is also, when you're talking about facts, one thing that struck me was that there has been an inquiry or an investigation into Lexa. that consisted of a visit to the offices of Intellexa. They have, if I understand correctly, verified 1 year of the accounts of Intellexa. They have not confiscated servers, computers, the administration. People have not been brought in for questioning. I imagine that by now, any evidence that existed has disappeared. So isn't it a bit strange to say, well, the European Parliament has to rely on, public sources, if on the other hand, the authorities go out of their way to make sure the evidence is not available anymore? And to be frank, this Parliament should have full powers of inquiry. We should have the right to summons people, to hear them under oath, and to get access to confidential documents. But we don't have those powers right now. And I'm actually quite proud that this Parliament is doing this inquiry with all the limited means that we have. And the fact that we're using public sources doesn't mean that the conclusions we draw are false. It only means that we can probably not prove it in court. It doesn't mean that it's not true. And I think there are enough pieces of the puzzle available by now to show there's a problem. And if I understand correctly, but correct me if I'm wrong, I understand that Mr. Mitsotakis has not denied the existence, the veracity of the list of 33, and there may be more to follow. He just says that the government had nothing to do with it, that it was an external actor. Well, we'll see. It's not a very plausible hypothesis, I think. But let's see what comes out of the investigations. But on the one hand, I understand the criticism and the frustration that we share about the non-availability of hard evidence. At the same time, I think that if you read the report and if you see how the different dots that we have connected, it does show a picture that's very, very difficult to deny. And I think it should be, let's say, an encouragement for the governments and the authorities to investigate. It should be a reason for them to allow parliamentary inquiries to be set up and not blocked and stonewalled. It should encourage governments to launch a police investigation. It should encourage governments to let Europol in and help the investigation. So rather than criticizing the European Parliament for at least trying to do something where the national governments are not doing it, I would say talk to the national governments and tell them to do their democratic duty.
Thank you. We are now exceeding our time slot and relying on the goodwill of our interpreters, so we have time for one more question. Maria Psaha, please, online.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me and see me, maybe. I'm Maria Psara from the Greek newspaper Efsin, Efemerides Takton. So I have 1.5 questions. Connecting the dots in Greece, how convinced are you that the Greek government is behind the surveillance? And how close was this system to the Prime Minister? And secondly, I read in your draft report that there are evidently politically motivated use of spyware. So I suppose that you don't share the government's argument that external actors or private citizens did the surveillance. Am I right? Thank you.
Well, have we got a smoking gun? No, we don't. But let's look at what we do know. We do know that spyware is sold mainly to governments. It is occasionally sold to individuals, but they have to be very, very rich because the stuff is incredibly expensive. So let's say that there is this individual, very, very rich individual behind it. I mean, somebody has to be seriously rich, not just a little bit a millionaire. No, you have to be almost a billionaire in order to be able to just pull this out of your pocket and pay for it. Then that person would have to have reasons, a motivation to surveil the people who are on the list, because the list has not been denied, that has not been pulled in question. So the list is real. So who would we have to do a little bit of detective work here. Who would have the motive, the means, and the opportunity? Now look at the names on the list. It's clearly a political list. So who would have an interest? Which individual would have the money and the interest of surveilling these particular people? Then another element is that some of these people have also been under, let's say, official surveillance that has been recognized by the government. So is that a coincidence then that these people are also on the list? I mean, you know, by way of elimination, you can sort of tick certain hypotheses off the list. And then, you know, the hypothesis that I've heard of an individual or an outsider doesn't strike me as particularly plausible, to be honest. But again, unless we get access to confidential information, we will not find a smoking gun.
Thank you.